All right, so in this video, I'm gonna go over my digital scouting process, specifically for deer hunting in marsh or swamp type areas. So I've basically picked an area that, number one, I haven't hunted before. Number two, I don't have any plans on hunting because I don't want to give away actual spots that I found. I want this to be more of a teach a guy to fish versus give the actual spots. And then also a lot of the places that I hunt, I also know other people who hunt, and if I gave away known good spots, it just wouldn't be fair to them either. So I'm gonna go over exactly what my process is as if I were to go into this area and really teach you how I use the tools, both before I actually go out in the woods. Then I'll circle back to this big picture on the computer and how it all ties together. I pretty much use onX as kind of my main system. I have for several years now. And sometimes I'll go over into different maps like Google Earth, for example, if I want to see something a little bit different. But for the most part, all the waypoints, all the tracks, all of the layers and things like that, I pretty much manage all that through onX. So here's the place that I picked over in Wisconsin. And as you can tell, even at a high level, this is for sure marsh habitat. You can see that there's a lot of open area, a lot of wetlands, and then you've got little islands and points all over the place. To start with, I like to leave all of these layers on, all the public land layers, all of the private land layers, and then I will remove layers if needed. The first thing that I'll typically do when I've identified a spot like this is where the different access locations, where are the different trails. What I'm trying to basically get a picture of is how and where other people might be accessing the spot, and then also good locations for me to want to scout and park my vehicle at so that I can draw maybe, a 4 or 5 or 6 mile loop for a given day that I might want to take a look at. Okay, so basically I just took a print off of the map with all of the access locations from the DNR website. You could do a split screen. I just got one screen pulled up, so it's easy enough for me to just print off a piece of paper and just look back and forth. So I'm still able to use that full screen with onX. And I'm just gonna go through here and start marking waypoints. And my system is basically to use color coordination where it makes sense so that I don't have just a big sea of red in terms of waypoints. I actually can look at it from a 10,000 foot view and be able to see, okay, right away, my mind just knows these are access points, these are white oak trees, these are tree stand locations, that sort of thing. So I'll choose the access waypoint icon and then I will select yellow. So I got the first one marked here, and then I will just go through real quick and mark all of the rest of these for a given area. Okay, so there are some more access points than what I just marked here right now, but I'm just gonna focus on this big chunk in this top left here, because if I draw an area shape, this area that we're looking at here is like in the ballpark of 7,500 acres, which is a lot of land. It's enough land that you could spend, good 2-3 years at least before you finally get to feel like you're starting to figure things out. So we're gonna start with that. The next thing I'm gonna do is go ahead and mark all the trails. You can see that there's this road running north to south right through the middle of this place. You can see there's another road here looping through the southwest, and then we got a road running north to south, and then a road also running on the northern border. Sometimes I'll mark the roads, but if they're really obvious like this, it's not really necessary, but I will go ahead and mark the trails as shown on the DNR website. Now when I'm marking this first trail here, you can actually see, if I zoom in, you can see this trail pretty clearly. So it makes it really easy to be able to actually follow the line that this trail is taking. And I don't know if this is a hunter access trail or if this is just like an old logging type trail. On various public lands that I'll go ahead and scout, it seems like you get a mixture of both. Sometimes you get logging roads that were used, and maybe the logging is well done and over, but you're still able to use those as access, and other hunters will use them as access. But then other times they're literally just access trails for the sole purpose of hunters to be able to use to get into the woods. And I will mark that yellow as well. Basically all of the access type stuff, I typically like to mark yellow. It's just kind of my personal process. And I'll go ahead and make that a small dashed line. And then I will use kind of the medium hash marks. If it's like a walking trail that I think I might want to take, sometimes I'll use the tiny dash marks. But if it's like a main logging road area like that, I'll use the medium dash. So I just went ahead and marked all these spots, or all these lines, all these trails. And in this northern central section here, this kind of, to me, almost has the look of something that was maybe clear cut. And you can see all those winding trails. Makes it seem like those could be logging type roads. And you can see there's little, smaller unmarked swaths that are cut through that. So I would anticipate that that was probably clear cut or logged at some point, and that's some remnants of that is the trail system that you see basically marked here. Because you only have basically what, 1, 2, 3 marked actual access spots as parking lots on the map, but you got a lot bigger overall trail system. And one thing that I would check too from the DNR website for this is this walking only? Are people able to use any kind of motorized vehicles, ATVs, e-bikes, things like that? Are you able to use pedal-powered bicycles? There's a lot of places I hunt where you're not even able to use pedal-powered bicycles. You're basically stuck to only walking. And I've even hunted some areas where you can't even bring wheeled game carts in to be able to retrieve your deer. So it's really good to just kind of double check at this point what the regulations are, because just based on the distance of some of these things, that's going to help play into how are guys using these trails. If they're just walking back in which case a 1.5 mile walk on one of these trails might separate you from a lot of the people. Or if it's really easy to use, bikes or ATVs or something like that, it might not matter how far you walk in on those trails. It might make a bigger difference for you to get off of those trails. So when I'm looking at this high level, I see this big area in the center here. Looks really wet. It looks like, to the best of my assumption, it's probably not a lot of cattails. It might be some bog and some of just that real low marsh grass, kind of waterbedy type stuff would be my assumption, just based on the way it kind of looks to me. But then you've got those interspersed islands that pop up, and some of them look like they have some decent elevation to them. And then there's probably some of these other areas that may also have cattails and things like that, but I don't see either, number one, a lot of cattails, or number two, some actual like hardwood swamps. It seems like it's more open marsh interspersed with those kind of hardwood islands, at least out in that main middle section. Look at these islands way out in the middle here. These by far look like the hardest thing to access, because there's just so much amount of this open marsh outside of it, and it's probably wet. It's probably not at all easy walking, especially if that marsh is not frozen. It looks like some of these islands you can probably access by kayak coming in from the northwest. And it looks like some of these other islands you can access pretty well from the road or this trail system right here. But these islands further out look like they're much harder to get to. And I've also seen islands like this where there's just not a lot of deer sign. You would think that, the harder it is to get to, the further away it is, the better chances you have. And that can be true, but it also, the deer need to have some reason to be out there too. If they're not getting pressured, if there's not good food out there, they might not need to go to those islands where there might be other stuff that's actually closer to the roads or the trail system that they're not getting pressured at, and they still have the food and the cover and the security and everything else that they need. But let's just zoom in here on OnX and take a closer look. I'm also going to take off the layer for the public land, because that will give me a little bit more realistic color. And I also will leave the private land layer turned on, so that when I get to the edges, I can still see where the edge of the private and public is. But when I scroll back onto the public itself, we got a nice clear picture. So as I zoom into some of these islands here, I'm looking for trails. I'm looking for points and little brushy spots in and around these islands, and trails leading to and from some of those areas. So right here I can see, this island for sure. You got this big trail system leading off that one point. Notice the shape of the islands. They're not just big round circles. You have a lot of diversity in and around those islands. You got little bowls within this one island. You got a couple different points. Like on the southwest side here, we got this little point. We got another point here right off the west side. We got this little brushy spot off the northwest of it. You got a little something right here. So there's a lot of little micro spots within a spot on this island that could potentially hold deer bedding. If I scroll further to the northwest, you can see once again there's a little trail heading out to this small brushy spot that leads up to the bigger part of the island. You got a point here and a little smaller micro island coming off to the southeast. You got another little tiny point right here on the east side, and on the northern side you got what looks like a nice little brushy finger and even some more brush right on the edge of that big pond or that lake, whatever you want to call it, and also some trails that kind of lead in there. And then it looks like there's some trails maybe heading around the outskirts of this island, and then nice point here hooking off to the south, and you have a couple of trails, it looks like here, that lead straight west. You got brush here, another small island here, and then you got what I would typically refer to as like a mainland here further to the west. So it seems like all of these things are connected, which indicates to me, as I see all these different trails, yeah, look at this island, even more sign, even more trails. You have this nice little brushy spot right here, trails heading both directions. And you can look at just the bare topo line, and that stuff will really pop too. You can see how we have a few islands out here, but these groups of islands right here kind of running in that northwest southeast line, you got a couple of them there that stick up a little bit higher, whereas even this stuff a little bit further to the north, you don't have that same elevation gain. So what that could indicate to me is that as I scroll in here, there may be a better likelihood that on some of these islands that have that little bit larger rise in topography, you might see a little bit bigger trees. You might start seeing some white oaks. Sometimes you got those islands that just barely kind of stick above the marsh. A lot of times they're a little bit brushier. They don't have some of those big trees, but the ones that stick up a little bit higher, those often are more likely to have bigger white oaks and food trees and things like that. I would definitely prefer to get out here when the marsh is frozen. It's tough to say for sure how deep the water could be, and you could have high water years, low water years, but I wouldn't even try to walk this without using at least hip boots. And you might get lucky and you might have a year where knee boots could be fine, but if I was gonna go scout this and it wasn't frozen, hip boots would be a minimum. But let's start marking waypoints here for that first scouting day. So when I plan a scouting day, I like to make a loop that I think is a reasonable amount of distance to be able to cover in a certain day. And for me, it seems like if I choose routes on the map that are somewhere in like the, 3 to 6 mile range, that for this type of habitat, that seems to be about right. Oftentimes those days will turn into like 7 or 8 miles. But if I start with a little bit lower amount of mileage, that gives me the ability to, deviate and go check this thing out and that thing out. And when you're marking these lines, they're always just kind of a straight line path. But in reality, you're actually going a lot further distance than what the straight lines would indicate. And I'm going to start that loop probably right down here on this road. There's no actual parking lot there, which again is something I don't mind at all, and I think it could probably help. I will go ahead and mark this as a truck spot, and I use a different icon for this than the access point just to indicate that it's not like a parking lot that's advertised. It's just a spot where I would want to basically park. So I'm going to try and draw this route in such a way that I basically hit as many of the key areas that I want to hit as possible, but also still make it realistic for a given day's amount of walking. So I'm just going to basically island hop here, starting off from the road. And as much as I'd like to be able to look at everything, I'm not going to be able to. So I'll just jump from that island to this one right here. And if I scroll in here, you can see that some of this stuff looks pretty good. Looks like I might want to check that out. And if I got onto this island and it just was not looking hot, I would just keep on going. But given that this looks pretty decent on the map, I'll go ahead and look at these smaller islands right here to see if they have beds on them. Then I'll come back to this island and just keep working my way up. And you got kind of a fork in the road here where I'd like to look at this stuff, I'd like to look at that stuff, but I'm gonna keep trying to stay as efficient as I can here and just work my way up this direction. And I'll check out all this stuff, even getting up to that lake edge. And then when I get all the way to the furthest part of my route here, I would ask the question, do I want to check this stuff out right here, or do I want to take a second scouting trip and actually hit it up from that much closer parking lot? And I think either answer is acceptable, but I'm going to basically choose to take that on a second day, and I will go back and take this route and try and hit stuff that I didn't necessarily hit the first time around. And then I will work my way back onto this main trail right here. So that's already, by the time I get back to the truck, gonna be a decent amount of mileage. So I am going to try and cut it a little bit short. So I'm gonna jump to maybe, let's say we'll jump right here, and I'll just work some of these furthest out islands on my way back to the vehicle. And you can see that that route that I just drew, I double click to stop the route there. That route is 4.53 miles. So I know that if my scouting day is going pretty well and I've been pretty efficient and I still have plenty of time, then maybe on the way back to the truck, I start hitting a little bit more of those islands to the north of the vehicle. So that's how I'll go through and plan this, basically from a high level, from the 10,000 foot view on the actual, Onyx on my computer. Also, the Hunting Beast DVDs can give you a really great background on exactly what to look for in marsh and swamp type areas as well. So I definitely recommend checking those out. All right, so let's pretend I just got back from that boots on the ground, first day, first loop, and I'm gonna go ahead and just delete that pre-planned route because I really don't have much of a need for it anymore. So now we just got that light blue dotted line that was basically my track for the day. And again, I just drew that in. This is totally made up, but it's drawn in such a way that it very closely represents what I would typically expect to see based on my experiences scouting similar types of areas. Spent a lot of time, just sitting around and studying, taking notes, taking video notes, pictures, all that kind of stuff, not just hightailing it from one area to another. Here's the waypoints and kind of the structure that I like to use. If it's a deer related waypoint, I like to keep it red. So if it's a rub, if it's a bed, if it's a tree stand location, usually I'll just stick with red. And typically when you look at food sources, a lot of times in these little islands like this, especially when you get an early opener like you have in, say, Wisconsin or Minnesota, those oak trees can be really hot throughout that month of September. And typically there's a lot more red oaks than there are white oaks. So I really don't spend time marking all of the red oaks. It would just be littered with waypoints. But if I get a nice sized white oak, I'll definitely mark those. And you can see that I basically use a food source icon, but I change that to white. And that in my mind signifies to me, hey, this was a white oak, it wasn't a red oak, it's a white icon. And it's really the only thing that I use a white icon for. As I go out to some of these spots, you can see that there were beds on like these little micro points, some of these smaller islands, a couple little beds right here on some of those smaller areas where they're not really raised up too much from the marsh, and they're on the smallest, kind of micro topography of those small areas. We've got a bed right here next to this tree. You can see the old matted down hair in the water, and on that dry piece there, right next to the base of this tree, this deer is exiting right there and heading out toward those woods where you can see that big tall aspen, and then a little bit to the right you got a couple of red oaks. The red oaks would be where I would set up. Very seldomly will you see that right in the middle of a block of something you'll have a bed. It's usually right on the edge or right on a point or right in a bowl or in a little patch of brush or a lone tree, something like that, someplace where you have edge. As we follow this line further out, if something is significant enough that, hey, I want to take a picture of this, I'll actually tie that to the waypoint. You can do that on Onyx. So if I go ahead and click on this rub icon here, this icon I basically just happened to attach an image to. So while I was out in the field theoretically here, I took a snapshot of this rub and tied it to that waypoint so that looking back at this thing sometime later in the year, I can say like, hey, this photo was taken here. That was a sizable rub, right? I can see some tine marks here that were probably up at about shoulder level. It was something that I thought was noteworthy to take a picture of while I was out in the field. And then also it was one of these here, yeah, I took a picture of one of those trees as well, where I can go ahead and look at that tree and be like, yeah, that's a pretty big tree. A lot of times we'll get, white oaks that might be about yay big. But if you get a really big one, and you can tell that that thing's dropping a lot of acorns, there's not much growing underneath it. You can tell there's a good canopy, so that once the leaves are there, it's really just that tree that you're able to just have acorns drop there. Deer are able to come in and collect underneath, and if it's remote enough, they'll be able to do that in daylight hours. Definitely something that's noteworthy. I don't always mark tree stand locations while I'm out there. Sometimes I do. If there's a really obvious setup, like look at this for example, if you had this deer bedding right here and you had this big white oak tree right here, then it would be really obvious of a setup to be able to set up there. And if I was able to sit in that bed and look back at the island and be able to say, okay, I need to be at least, that far away to be able to set up undetected, then I can go ahead and mark that exact tree. Maybe I'll even take a picture of it, attach it to the waypoint so that I know looking back at it, okay, when I'm going in this setup, I need to basically set up in this exact tree. Then when I go back out there, however many months later, I can look at the image and be like, yep, that's the tree I want to get in. And then when I get into that spot, I can go ahead and verify it. And then for me, typically the other color that I'll oftentimes use, and there's really no rhyme or reason to it, is I'll use the purple color to signify somebody else's hunter sign. If it's a ladder stand or a hang on, sometimes I'll use the actual hang on tree stand icon or the ladder stand icon, but I'll still mark it purple. I'll mark a purple trail camera icon to signify that somebody else left a trail camera there. And then I go back and look at the big picture to be able to see, okay, that's where they're hunting. They might be accessing from, XYZ, so on and so forth. I use the scrape icons too, especially if it's a bigger scrape. And a lot of times I'll see on some of these trail system type areas where you have those access trails or logging roads that are adjacent to a lot of bedding. A lot of times I'll just see that stuff just lit up with scrapes. Sometimes you get a scrape every 60, 70 yards in those types of logging roads. And I think oftentimes a lot of that sign is made at night, but it signifies to me if I'm able to walk that yellow line during the season and be able to see that there's a bunch of scrapes and stuff torn up, well, that would indicate to me that a lot of those bedding islands around there are going to have a lot of deer in that area right now making that sign. So that would be something I could key on during the season as well. And then when we jump back up to the 10,000 foot view here and look at what we basically accomplished for that day, you can see that the way I marked this up, a lot of the really good sign was some of the stuff closer to the lake where we had those bigger islands that were very irregularly shaped, lots of micro features within those islands, lots of white oaks, lots of beds, some nice sized rubs. Those deer have everything that they need to live out there. They got cover, they got security because not that many people are going to be going out after them out there. If it's wet enough, they might not have too many coyotes out there, right? I used to think that in order to get to some of those really remote islands, those deer would need to get pressured out back to those remote spots. But that's not necessarily the case. They might just be living out there in, perfect peace. Even after those acorns are dropped, if you have like the big firearm season, the big 9-day season, a lot of times that might push those deer back into some of those further areas, even if they hadn't been there earlier in the season, or if they had been there earlier in the season and then moved back to a different food source once the leaves dropped and once the acorns all dried up, and then the pressure might have pushed them back out there. So some of those islands, especially the ones where you get a lot of different connections or they are just kind of natural corridors leading out from some of those more readily accessible spots, those can be good places to be able to set up for gun season movement as well. So looking at this again, really the only thing left is to be able to try and figure out exactly what winds and what locations I would most likely want to hunt in. And there's probably, during this time, there's usually a lot of fresh memories in my mind. If I was able to pick out an exact tree in the woods, that's great, that's ideal, I mark it. But if not, I'm able to still go back in the 10,000 foot view and be able to figure out, okay, if I want to hunt this spot for this bed, this food source, I'm going to access at this location and maybe take this route in. And then I might move on to day 2 and do the exact same thing. With big chunks of land like this, there's a lot of options. There's some really easy ways to be able to use the mapping software to be able to get the information you need, tie all that stuff together, look at it at just a big picture view, and be able to see, okay, here's the deer sign, here's the food sources, here's the other hunter sign, here's the access trails. And for me, at least, as being a very visual person, that helps a lot. Okay, so one other thing I'll show you, while I typically use OnX is, my 90% of the time thing, that's what I'm basically using for all of my logistics and waypoints and that sort of thing. If I want to get a little bit better view or even different timestamps of a given area, I'll sometimes jump into Google Earth and look at them side by side. So I'll just bounce over to Google Earth quick, just kind of show you we have this same area pulled up in Google Earth right now. And what you can do is you can actually click on this little icon right up here, and then you can look at it on a history view. So it looks like there was imagery from 2017, and I can go back and click in previous years and see different imagery, right? So you can see from January 2017, we got a view that at least on this west side of this line looks different. It looks like it was taken postseason. It looks like it's not all green like you got for whatever reason. There's a big split right here. And I can tell that I get something a little bit different on this line right here. Look at how defined that trail looks like to get to that island right there. With Google Earth, it seems like the more highly populated an area is, the better imagery you tend to get. This place that we're looking at right now does not have very good imagery. It is way out in, not the middle of nowhere, but it's fairly far from any major cities. And there's only a couple years worth of historical photos. So this isn't really maybe the best example. But real quick, I'll just go find another example of a different spot to show you what Google Earth can be capable of. Okay, so here's another place, another marsh type area in Google Earth. And this one's closer to a bigger metropolitan area. And it just kind of defaults in Google Earth to the 3D view. So I can actually zoom in here and I can use the middle button on my mouse to actually scroll around and actually look at this in 3D. And they used to just have this with big buildings and things like that. But as you can see here, even on the tree line and some of these islands, you can go ahead and look at this stuff in 3D. It's really pretty remarkable, and be able to tell, hey, we got bigger trees over here, we got smaller trees or just kind of brush over there, and be able to make decisions based on, again, what exactly you might be seeing here. Like if we look at this point right here, as it kind of tapers out, you get smaller trees, maybe there's a bed on the end of that point right there. And then again, in this same type of area, you can turn on the historical data, can get it back to more of a 2D view, and then you can go back and look at some of the historical images throughout the years. And being a more metropolitan type area, they're going to have a little bit bigger database of various waypoints throughout the years. Occasionally, depending on the county, you can go to the county GIS website and oftentimes get better aerial imagery or topo lines than you can even get on Google Earth. So definitely doesn't hurt to go and check that out. You might get a little bit different perspective. Sometimes you get photos where the imagery was taken when the sun was a little bit lower in the sky and you get really good defined trails. Sometimes the resolution is better than others. So it's never a bad idea just to see what kind of historical imagery is available for a given area. And again, I don't really use Google Earth that much anymore for actually storing my waypoints and drawing routes and things like that. I pretty much use OnX for all of that type of work. It's really easy to use in the field, and it connects really easy between the computer and the app and all that sort of stuff. So I just use this cyclical process of digital scout, then boots on the ground, then digital scout, then boots on the ground. And then during hunting season, it's hunt, look at the maps, hunt, look at the maps. And the more you just kind of continue in that cyclical approach, at least for me, it really helps in the learning curve for being able to figure out a given area. So I hope this tutorial was really helpful for you guys. I do have an affiliate link for OnX in the description down below. If you'd like to see more of these types of videos, maybe a different type of habitat, hill country or river bottom, something like that, let me know in the comments. And thanks for watching.